Newry, Maine. A peaceful, quaint town where crime is a rare and strange phenomenon. A man named Christian Charles Nielsen is staying in the Black Bear Bed and Breakfast, which is seeing some traffic over the Labor Day weekend, seeing as Newry is a resort town. Working as a cook at the Sudbury Inn in Bethel, Maine, Nielsen was paying to rent out a small shed converted into a room in the backyard of the inn, which was owned by a woman named Julie Bullard. However, by September 5, 2006, 4 people at the inn would be found murdered in one of the most shocking homicide cases in the state of Maine. Christian Charles Nielsen was born on May 2, 1975, in Rumford, Maine. Rumford is a considerably small town with a strong historical background in the region. When he was around 4 years old, Nielsen's parents would file for divorce, and a custody battle would ensue for the next 2 years. Nielsen's mother, Patricia, had been involved in a relationship with a man named Michael Lewitt, who was known to law enforcement and frequently found himself in trouble, including serving time at the state prison in Windham for burglary, theft, and receiving stolen property. Despite Lewitt's criminal history, Patricia would marry him, and her relationship with Lewitt would ultimately sway the court's opinion on the custody battle. In 1982, a district court judge ruled that Nielsen's mother did not have the emotional stability to care for young children, and so Nielsen's father would take custody of both him and his younger sister. However, this wouldn't be the only time Nielsen's father, Charles, would divorce. At some point, Charles would marry a woman named Carol, and just before Nielsen graduated from Mount Blue High School in Farmington, Charles and Carol would divorce. However, that divorce was legally uncomplicated and did not involve custody disputes. The marriage to Carol had also been a deciding factor in the 1982 custody ruling, as a psychologist had determined that Charles and Carol seemed to have a healthy and stable marriage. She had also apparently expressed support of Charles's desire to gain custody of the children and was considerably positive and realistic in her perceptions of becoming a stepmom. However, the marriage would still end, and Charles would marry another woman named Lee Graham. Charles Nielsen was also employed as an English teacher at the Dirigo High School in Dixfield, Maine, and seemed to be well-liked. Nothing remarkable stood out about Nielsen in his childhood, and his friends, co-workers, neighbors, and others who knew him described him as being normal in his youth. He did not seem to have gotten in stints with the law, nor had he demonstrated the typical behavior of eventual serial killers or murderers, like assault and other forms of violence. Nielsen's criminal past mostly related to traffic violations, such as a 1998 arrest and conviction for a drunk driving charge. In 2001, Nielsen would attend the University of Maine and would pursue a degree in English until he left in 2004 without having earned his degree. Despite this outward appearance, Nielsen would have already begun fantasizing about murdering people and even becoming a serial killer when he was just 13 years old. Nielsen frequently visited a bookstore known as Devaney Doak and Garrett Booksellers in Farmington, Maine, and the owner, Kenny Breckner, found that Nielsen was unpredictable when it came to his personality. He would often appear closed off sometimes, and then other times was very bright. He preferred reading classic literature and comedy books, but he didn't seem to have any radical ideologies or a remarkably strange personality. At some point in 2005, Nielsen would be issued a summons for driving under suspension. At that time, he'd been living in a 5-unit apartment building in downtown Farmington, near the University of Maine campus. He would go on to work at the Fair restaurant in Farmington for a while and seemed to have a drinking problem. He claimed that he wanted to fix up his life, quit drinking, and would even join the U.S. military to straighten out. However, after being fired from the Fair restaurant, it seemed like he scrapped all of those previous plans of his. In 2006, Nielsen would move into a converted farmhouse behind the Black Bear Bed and Breakfast Inn, which was owned by a 65-year-old woman named Julie Bullard. Nielsen would work shifts in the kitchen at the Sudbury Inn. Around that time of the year, the Black Bear saw quite a good amount of traffic, as it was around Labor Day, and people often took vacations. The Black Bear itself had been opened by Bullard after she moved from San Francisco to Bethel, Maine. She and her daughter, Selby, would open the new location in Maine together. Selby had just recently lost her husband in a car crash and was left with her 2 children. Selby would also operate an optician's shop. She'd also received a real estate license and worked at Apple Tree Realty, Inc. In February of that year, Bullard appeared to have wanted to close and sell the Black Bear. She had apparently found it difficult to survive financially running the inn in Maine and wanted to move to New York City with another daughter of hers. She would have rented out the room to Nielsen to make some extra money. Julie had liked Maine and apparently found it to be safe, and she didn't really want to leave, but finances ultimately drove her decision. On September 1st, 2006, Nielsen would invite a man named James Whitehurst to go fishing with him in Upton, Maine, a town neighboring Bethel. Whitehurst was 50 years old at the time and had moved to Maine from Arkansas. He would have been temporarily staying at the Black Bear and working as a handyman for the owner in exchange for a free room. What Whitehurst didn't know, though, was that Nielsen had purchased a firearm and some ammo earlier that day. Whitehurst would accept Nielsen's offer, and the two of them would head out to a local Subway for lunch. Afterwards, they'd go to a wooded part of Upton, just 15 miles away from the Black Bear Inn. In the woods, Nielsen would suddenly pull out a firearm and shoot Whitehurst multiple times, fatally wounding him. He would then leave Whitehurst's body and head out to work his shift in the Sudbury Inn. The next day, Nielsen returned to the murder site with the intentions of digging a grave. However, instead of that, he decided to dismember and burn Whitehurst's body. He returned to the Black Bear Inn, and the next morning, fearing that Bullard would find Whitehurst's disappearance suspicious, he broke into Bullard's bedroom as she slept and would proceed to fatally shoot her as well. After this, he dragged Bullard's body out to the nearby woods and proceeded to dismember her, wrapping the remains with a tarp before heading back to work. Selby Bullard would try to contact her mother via cell phone the next day, but when Julie didn't answer, Selby and a friend named Cindy Beatson drove out to the Black Bear to check on her. Julie had bad asthma and would often get into coughing fits, and Selby was afraid her mother had had a medical emergency. Nielsen, fearing that Selby would find her mother's disappearance suspicious, proceeded to fatally shoot both her and Sydney, and then dismember them as well. The following day, on September 5th, Nielsen would call his father and claim that Julie Bullard was in California and that she'd left him in charge of the inn for a few days. That night, Charles and Lee Graham would arrive at the inn and discover a dead body outside. They'd immediately call the police, but before law enforcement arrived, Lee Graham would phone 911, claiming that Nielsen had confessed to her that he was behind the murders. Police would arrive at the inn and were able to find Nielsen's handgun inside. Nielsen would be arrested immediately, and he would also provide police with a 2-hour-long confession detailing fully how he committed all of the murders. He would also tell law enforcement about the location of Whitehurst's body, which hadn't been found at the time. It isn't clear what precisely spurred Nielsen to commit murder. Friends of the victims believed that it may have been over a rent dispute for his room at the inn, and that apparently Bullard and Whitehurst may have been involved in an effort to evict Nielsen after he failed to pay his rent. The idea of a rent dispute preceding the murders, however, was never confirmed. Nielsen himself never provided police with a genuine explanation or motive behind why he committed the murders. The only motive he ever gave for Whitehurst's death was that Whitehurst was apparently objectionable, though it's not clear what Nielsen meant by that. Nielsen apparently also told police that he had been obsessed with thoughts of killing someone for years, and that he wanted to take over the Black Bear Inn. However, he still would not provide a specific motive. The news of the quadruple homicide came as a complete shock to this quaint area of Maine where crime is considerably rare. Nielsen would be held without bail, and in his first court appearance he didn't speak except to say, "I am," when asked if he was present by the judge. He had apparently even smiled as he was brought into the courtroom and even as he left it. A psychiatric assessment would be made of Nielsen to determine if he was competent enough to stand trial. His lawyers had initially attempted to pursue the insanity defense, claiming that Nielsen was emotionally detached and incapable in assisting his defense. 2 psychologists analyzed him, and one said that he was competent enough to assist in the defense, while the other stated that his mental health prevented him from doing so. The two psychologists did agree that Nielsen was mentally ill and that he suffered from schizoid personality disorder and likely Asperger's syndrome, which was an old term used to refer to what is considered today part of the autism spectrum. Schizoid personality disorder is typically characterized by a lack of interest in social relationships, secretive behavior, emotional coldness, and apathy. Individuals with what used to be called Asperger's syndrome often experienced trouble making eye contact, feeling awkward in social settings, missing social cues, struggling with body language, and displaying few emotions, as well as repetitive behavior and a tendency towards intensive routines. The psychologist also stated that there may have been other mental health conditions involved as well. Initially, Nielsen was held at the Oxford County Jail until his trial was set to begin. However, while in prison, he would attack another inmate. This would cause him to be transferred to the Cumberland County Jail. While in Cumberland, he would go on a hunger strike, causing him to drop 55 pounds from 158 to 103. The sheriff at the jail would obtain a court order to insert a feeding tube, but Nielsen would begin eating on his own before the tube could be used. In December 2006, Nielsen would use a razor to carve a letter into his skin, which placed him on suicide watch. Nielsen's lawyer would change Nielsen's plea to not criminally responsible following his mental health diagnosis. However, he was still deemed competent to stand trial since he was not suffering a psychotic episode during the murders, meaning that he was able to willingly make decisions. Nielsen's defense lawyer, Ron Hoffman, recommended for Nielsen to continue with a trial using the insanity defense in the hopes of having Nielsen be treated at a psychiatric hospital rather than sit in a state prison. However, Nielsen did not want to go to trial and would drop the insanity defense just one day before a jury was meant to begin the trial. He would also plead guilty to the killings and did not provide an explanation as to why he did, saying that he couldn't explain it. At his sentencing, Nielsen apologized to the families of the victims. However, their lives were forever scarred by his incomprehensible actions. He would be sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences for the 4 murders, which in the state of Maine carries no chance of parole. One of the psychologists who analyzed Nielsen's mental health status, Dr. Charles Robinson, said that even he couldn't understand what drove Nielsen to commit the murders. He stated that Nielsen, despite having spoken to him at least 20 different times, was a puzzle, and that he didn't understand what happened to cause Nielsen to take such a dark path in life. Nielsen is currently carrying out his 4 concurrent life sentences behind bars at the Maine State Prison, and to this day his quadruple homicide rampage remains as one of the most violent in recent Maine history.